Ви знаєте, сьогодні 600 тисяч трішки плюс російського контингенту на території нашої держави. Так? Може трішки мінус, в залежності, як сьогодні наші хлопці попрацювали. Що стосується української армії, сьогодні вона 880 тисяч. Але ми повинні 880 тисяч захищати всю територію. Російські війська зосереджені в деяких напрямках. І тому там в деяких напрямках у них є кількісна перевага.
Toretsk is nearly occupied, with a major breach in Ukrainian positions near Chasiv Yar. Pokrovsk is gradually being surrounded, and Russian forces are advancing into the Dnipro region while crossing the Oskil and Zerabets River to attack Kupyansk and Liman. The Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kursk region has yielded minimal results. Ukrainian media reports that on one hand, the situation does appear dire for Ukraine, but at the same time, they do not anticipate that any of these threats will turn into a victorious scenario for Russia before Trump's inauguration, and speculate that most of the Russian plans will not be realized for a long time. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces cannot stop the gradual advance of the Russians, but as another hopeful speculation, the Ukrainian command assumes that the Russian army is also exhausted and that the pace of the advance has significantly slowed down. You see, since the beginning of the year, Russia has intensified its offensives on several fronts. Currently, its priority is the battle for Pokrovsk and the expulsion of Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region, or so some in the Ukrainian command think. The all-important question for Ukraine, however, is can their army stop Russia's advance and stabilize the front? Indeed, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated at the beginning of the year that the goal of Ukraine's defense forces in January is to stabilize the front. According to Zelensky, this is possible through the training of new soldiers and the arrival of new weapons. Donald Trump's team also discusses stabilizing the front. Mike Waltz, whom the elected US president plans to appoint as his national security advisor, calls it a necessary condition for a peace agreement with Russia. So today's video will be a more in-depth analysis for this past week on the front lines in Ukraine. We will be covering the Kurakhove, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupyansk, and finally the Kursk front in that order. While Pokrovsk still remains the main focus in the media for the Ukrainian armed forces, each one of these fronts are in a state of crisis. So grab a seat, leave some superthank love, and let's begin today's report. But as a reminder, the uncensored and complete versions of all footages and video clips will be available for the membership community only. To access it, watch the introductory video in the end screen and join, and let's get into it. Just briefly, before we get into the frontline analysis, a brief preface as to how we got here is necessary. The fall of Ugledar in October of last year significantly worsened the position of Ukrainian troops across the entire southern Donetsk front. One of the Russian groupings moved north from Ugledar to help capture Kurakhove, while another turned west to advance on Velika Novoselka. In December, the Russians approached Velika Novoselka from the north and the east. At the beginning of this year, the Russians likely reached the city's southern outskirts, capturing the village of Netskuchny. Recently, Russian forces completed the capture of Kurakhove. Now, Ukrainian units maintain control over a small territory in the area of the settlement of Dachny, located west of Kurakhove. However, it is highly likely that in the near future, Ukrainian troops will have to withdraw from there to Konstantinovka due to the risk of encirclement. As previously predicted by many, capturing Kurakhove has allowed the Russians to shift their focus to Pokrovsk. Their goal is to create an operational encirclement around the city. So let's begin with Kurakhove and Pokrovsk. After the occupation of Kurakhove, the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing to defend a new fortified area within the triangle of the villages of Andriivka, Konstantinovka, and Ulakli, as well as along the Vovcha and Suky Yali rivers. However, some of the Ukrainian troops are still defending along the Suky Yali river, where the Russians have been attempting daily advances from the villages of Zelensky, Suky Yali, and Konstantinopel. Here, the Russian army is trying to cross the river at various points and break through the road from Yantani to Dachny. Currently, fighting is ongoing for the small village of Yantani, half of which is under Russian control, but the Ukrainian defense forces are preventing them from gaining further success. If, however, Russia manages to capture Dachny, the position of Ukrainian forces will worsen sharply, and the situation will repeat itself, similar to the encirclement that occurred a month ago, slightly south in the area of Aspenivka. Despite having no significant success on this section of the front, the Russian troops are simultaneously attempting to resolve the issue by attacking in the direction of Konstantinopel and Ulakli. However, in the past few weeks, the Ukrainians have repelled most of the attacks in this area. To the north along the Vovcha River, interesting events unfolded. On one side, the Russian army is advancing from the village of Shevchenko towards Andriivka along the river, while on the other side, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a counterattack and retook part of the village of Shevchenko. Although the Ukrainian forces withdrew relatively quickly from Petropavlivka and Slovyansk, they have taken up positions along the ravines and are preventing the Russians from advancing further west. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian General Staff has already established a new fortified area in this section of the front. Novopavlivka, located in the eastern Dnipro region, has become a key settlement that gave its name to the new front. As a result, the Ukrainian General Staff has merged the previously separated Kurakhove and Kupyansk directions, which have now effectively disappeared. Now, most in the Ukrainian command hope that the encirclement of Pokrovsk will take a few months, if not half a year. In fact, most Ukrainian experts believe that the timing of the Battle of Pokrovsk depends not so much on the Russians as on the resilience of the Ukrainian forces on this front. Some had predicted the loss of the city by the end of September, but the Russians are still at least 4 kilometers away from it. Clearly, the Pokrovsk area will become the epicenter of fighting in the coming months. However, Russian forces are methodically and ruthlessly carrying out their objective. Furthermore, following the conquest of Kurakhove, the front line has drastically reduced, freeing up additional resources for the Russians, which they moved to the Pokrovsk front. On a stretch of over 11 kilometers from Yaznevy to Ostenivka, the Russians have made small progress. While they are steadily moving westward towards the Dnipro region, their territorial gains amount to only hundreds of meters per week. Currently, the Russians have begun occupying Yaznevy, while fighting is going in the center of the village. They have also finally occupied Novo Elisavetovka and started advancing towards Nadivka. Similarly, the long battle for Novo Vasilivka ended with the Russian occupation, after which Russian forces turned their focus to Ospenivka. The situation is much more complicated in the area between the Solona River and Pokrovsk for the Ukrainian army, as this is where the Russians, moving north, are trying to bypass Pokrovsk and cut off its logistic routes. After occupying the villages of Bobche and Solony, they proceeded to cut the Pokrovsk-Mezova road and reached it between the villages of Kotliny and Udachny. To secure their positions, the Russians are forced to attack both villages, which were previously held by the Ukrainian forces, making the battle here likely to be prolonged. The Russian advance between Pishany and Kotliny towards Virova, which is already a de facto suburb of Pokrovsk, looks quite dangerous for the Ukrainians. Over the past week, the Russian army has moved more than 800 meters here. It is likely that the Russians will not only continue towards Pokrovsk, but also bypass Kotliny to capture Ukrainian positions. On the entire southern front of Pokrovsk, active assaults continue, with the Russian forces trying to get as close as possible to the city. They have succeeded in cutting the road to Mezova, as I mentioned earlier, one of the two roads connecting Pokrovsk with the Dnipro region. In addition, the Russians seem to be planning to cut the second road, which leads to Pavlohrad, and approach Pokrovsk from the west. At the beginning of the year, Russian forces also intensified its right flank on the Pokrovsk front, where they began to break through towards the T-0504 road, or the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka near Vozdvizenka. According to media sources, one Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group recently managed to reach this road but was repelled. Although the T-0504 is no longer used to supply Pokrovsk, physical control of this road would open the way for the Russians to the city's northeastern outskirts. Reaching this road creates risks for another key defensive node for the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, Konstantinovka. This settlement, in turn, stands on the Russians' path to the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. Battles for Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupyansk, and Liman are all part of this plan. And to explain all these logistical routes in Donetsk from Kupyansk and Pokrovsk, I advise you to go and watch my own analysis, the thumbnail of which is right here, and it is for channel members only, creating conditions for the Russian conquering of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Now Toretsk, my friends, has become a large grey zone.
Этажку зашли штурмом, вот, отштурмовали, освободили, вот, там семья была, 3 женщины, девчонка 12-летняя и отец ихний, она подошла в слезах.
Russian forces have captured the central part of the city and significantly intensified the offensive on other districts. The Russian army has infiltrated many buildings in areas under Ukrainian control. As a result, most of the part of Toretsk previously held by the Ukrainian forces has now become a grey zone. This week, the Russians continued to push towards the western outskirts of the city, further dividing Ukrainian defenses between the northern and southern neighborhoods. The Ukrainian forces still control about 10 to 15% of the city, including the Toretsk mine on the northwestern outskirts and part of the spoil heaps of the central mine in the southern part. On the other hand, the Russian army has failed to break through the flanks and surround Toretsk. The Ukrainian forces still hold Leonidivka and the front line along Dachny and Krimsky, which allows for a gradual retreat. However, it is important to acknowledge that the battle for Toretsk has been lost for Ukraine, and its full occupation is just a matter of weeks.
Рассказывают о военных преступлениях украинских боевиков.
Было такое, что переодевались и убивали людей в подвал.
And close by, the defense for Chasiv Yar, which has held for a year and 3 months, is starting to show serious weaknesses.
What? That sucks.
This week, Russian forces managed to break through toward the railway station, although they have not yet captured it. However, they now control the northern district and part of the neighboring Desyata district. Additionally, the Russian army has taken over the main workshop of the refractory factory and started advancing on another large workshop across from the railway station. The Ukrainian armed forces were also forced to retreat from another district, Novyi, which borders the canal. As a result, the Ukrainian forces have completely withdrawn from the defense line along the canal in the city and concentrated on defending the outermost western neighborhoods. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian forces managed to slow the breakthrough and stabilize the situation to some extent. The battle for Chasiv Yar is not yet lost, according to Ukrainian command. It continues. However, given the significant deterioration of the situation near Toretsk, which will also affect the Chasiv Yar front, discussions have already begun about preparing Konstantinovka for active urban combat. Now, further up north, the Ukrainian armed forces have so far been unable to eliminate the bridgehead that the Russian armed forces have created south of Vyrichna. Moreover, the Russians have expanded it by capturing half of the settlement and pushing south to the outskirts of the village of Zakidny. The Russian forces' clear intention is to create a threat to Kupyansk by advancing on both sides of the Oskil River. From there, they will move toward Kivsharivka, as capturing it would allow the Russians to unite their front line and form a strong strike force aimed at Kupyansk. To achieve this, the Russians are daily sending troops to the other side of the Oskil River. However, It is still possible to neutralize this bridgehead if the Ukrainian armed forces can allocate additional resources to deal with it. And lastly, to the northernmost position in the Kursk front. The Russians attempted to break through to Suja and attack the village of Makhnivka, located 2 kilometers to the south. However, Ukrainian forces were able to repel them, forcing them to retreat, and the gray zone expanded to Chereskara, Konoplanka. Nonetheless, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has also slowed down. Initially, Ukrainian forces captured the village of Beretsky and Novoselivka, but after intense fighting, Russian forces managed to push them back out. At the same time, the Russians counterattacked and advanced from Nakayev to Ruskaye Poreshnoye. On the northern flank, Russian forces attacked the village of Pogrepki, where fighting is still ongoing. Despite this, the Russians managed to move a significant portion of the western front eastward, covering a stretch of 10 kilometers from Pogrepki to Malaya Lochnia, where Ukrainian forces are building a new defense line along the Malaya Lochnia River. The most intense Russian assault occurred at Malaya Lochnia, where they attacked Viktorivka and Nikolaivka, which are 500 meters from the village. However, Ukrainian troops successfully repelled the attack, or so they claim. On the eastern flank, the Russians not only attempted to break through to Berydlikovo to sever Ukrainian defenses, but also made several attempts to attack across the border to Zuravka. All these attacks, according to the Ukrainian defense, have been repelled.
Вот тут в конце полки ягоза получается, там проход есть. Сейчас еще тут срежем, чтобы 2 прохода было.